So we have a mixture of senior and middle management from across all the institutions. Special because it's part of a day of mindfulness, at least as regards practitioners in the, mainly in the European Commission. Special because this is being web streamed, and those practitioners, and we hope 20,000 of the staff around the institutions will be following proceedings. And special in particular because we have a very special guest, Jon Kabat-Zinn. I think I can just resume as a title, the Master of Mindfulness. Yeah. And we've had a very interesting...
When I was in Holland, I was introduced as the originator of mindfulness. But a little bit off.
Well, whichever you prefer. And we're extremely honored and pleased to have Jon here, particularly as mindfulness is a word which is on everybody's lips, I think, at the moment. And quite frequently when a word is on everybody's lips, that's when it gets dangerous. Yeah. Because not everybody's lips are synchronized with the real meaning of what's coming out. And so we're waiting to hear from the originator or the master, Jon, all about mindfulness, and in particular, how we, as people who should be caring for our people, can improve the way in which we do that. Jon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And it's an absolute delight for me to be here with you. And is it all right if I just walk back and forth and you can follow me? Okay. So it's a delight to be here with all of you who are in the room and with whoever is out there in the world of web streaming who's taken the time to tune into this gathering. So in a very real way, as happens a lot in this digital era, we're moving into a domain that's beyond time and beyond space. So this is just kind of like available out there and is in some sense a kind of diagnostic of the sort of global way in which we now work, communicate, understand each other, and live. So I will try in the sort of brief time that I have, we'll go until 2 o'clock, to give you a sense of what mindfulness really is, because there is now an enormous amount of hype about it. As David said, you know, it's on everybody's lips. That is actually not such a great sign. I mean, it is and it isn't, because when anything gets popular, then it actually gets denatured usually and gets dumbed down to the point that the essence of it is potentially unrecognizable, and then pretty soon in 2 years' time, something else will be a la mode, and no one will ever talk about mindfulness again, and that would potentially be a tragedy. And the reason that mindfulness is on everybody's lips is because there's been a kind of history over the past 36 years of the scientific investigation of the effects of practicing, cultivating mindfulness among different groups of people. And it started out with my work and then the work of my colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in the Department of Medicine and in the adjacent hospital with people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. In 1979 in the US, there were cracks in the healthcare system, and a lot of people did not get full satisfaction from whatever the medical treatments were that were available for, you name it, any conceivable chronic disease, stress-related disorders, chronic pain disorders, chronic diseases, cancer, heart disease, virtually everything. And in 1979, people were falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. Now in the US, the healthcare system doesn't have cracks. It has Grand Canyons. It has chasms. You know, it's like falling apart. And it's not merely me that's saying that, but, you know, very high-level people who are deans of medical schools and chancellors of university who are physicians are saying the medical system in the United States is going to hell. At the same time that the scientific foundation for modern medicine is discovering more and more interesting things, and the medicine is becoming so technological that the patient and the person as a person, life can actually be lost in the process. So that while the medicine may be extraordinarily effective in some cases, we're not treating medical conditions, we're treating human beings. And when the human being gets lost, there's a certain amount of harm that gets generated, sometimes even violence. In English, that the word for that is iatrogenic, doctor-caused harm. And the ethical foundation, and mindfulness always has an ethical foundation for it. I'll say in a minute, I was joking that in Holland, you know, they did advertise me as the inventor of mindfulness. So I have to tell you that mindfulness is spoken of often as the heart of Buddhist meditation. Okay, so if you want someone to invent it, well, it would be the Buddha 2,600 years ago, not me. But even the Buddha didn't invent it. What Buddhism has done is given the world the most elaborate and sophisticated articulation of mindfulness, but mindfulness is just another word for awareness. And awareness isn't captured by a particular culture or spiritual tradition or anything. It's really universal. And that awareness is coupled with attention, that you can't really inhabit or taste awareness without paying attention. So it truly is universal. So this has, even though its most elaborate articulation is in the Buddhist tradition, and we have a lot to learn from that, this is not about becoming a Buddhist. Even the Buddha was not a Buddhist. And what the word Buddha means is actually awake. So the question is, are we in some sense sleepwalking through our lives, and is it possible to wake up while we're still alive? Our famous philosopher of the 19th century, Henry David Thoreau. Have you heard of Henry David Thoreau? So he went off to, he lived in my neighborhood. I live in Lexington, Massachusetts, and he lived in Concord, and Walden Pond is in Concord, and he went off to live. He built a cabin, a little cabin, one-room cabin at Walden Pond, and he lived there for 2 years, and he wrote a book about it afterwards called Walden, and he was something of a naturalist, a scientist, a poet, a literary figure, and he said this about why he went to live at Walden. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live, and this was in 1840. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what they had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I hadn't lived. So that's really the challenge of mindfulness. All of Walden is in some sense a rhapsody to mindfulness. He didn't use the word mindfulness, but mindfulness is really about relationality. The more I've gotten into this, the more I've sort of tried to simplify how I talk about it. And so if you ask me, well, in one word, what is mindfulness? It's about relationality. How are you going to be in relationship to whatever you might want to be in relationship to? Whatever. So one place to start, very interesting place to start, would be your own life. How are you in relationship to your own life? Where are you in the arc of your life? And do you know where you're going? And do you even care? And are you living in the kind of narrative of the life of your arc, or actually living your life? Because you could live in the narrative for 30 or 40 years and then wake up like Thoreau and say, whoa, I got the whole thing wrong, and then die. So in yoga, I know there was this like big yoga day not that long ago. So in yoga, there are said to be 84,000 main postures. That's a lot of postures in Hatha yoga, and at least 10 variants of every one. So that's 840,000. If you do the math of how many different sequences there might be of any 10 or 15 or 20 yoga postures that you might stick into an hour and a half long class, that's like an infinite number of variants, okay? But the most challenging posture, it is said in Hatha yoga, is what's called the corpse pose, which is like lying down on your back with your feet falling away from each other and your arms alongside the body but not touching. The corpse pose, it's called the corpse. Why? Because the invitation is to actually die now, get it over with, and then wake up or live the rest of your life in the only moment you ever have. But most of the time we're not inhabiting that moment, because when you start to pay attention to where your mind is, which is how you cultivate mindfulness, is you start to pay attention to what's on your mind. And what the thing that is so astonishing and that we often is so surprised by, because you'd think we'd have discovered it by now, is that we're almost always in the future or in the past. And yet we're only alive in this moment. We can only express love or learn or inspire somebody else or breathe a moment of the air outside in the springtime in Brussels or whatever it is in this moment. But most of the time, we're in the future. Say, and what are our favorite pastimes in the future? Well, planning for how things should be in the future and worrying about how they will either or won't be that way, you know. And it's like a little bit like driving the car with your brake on, with the emergency brake on. And, you know, and people talk about burnout, and I've been told that that's a significant concern in the EU. Okay, just in the work setting. And why would I not be surprised? Why am I surprised by that? I'm not, you know, because that's a significant concern in virtually every organization. That, have you noticed that there's no end to your to-do list? If you have, do you keep to-do lists? You know, I mean, at a certain age, you have to keep to-do lists because you can't remember all the things you have to do. And it's highly embarrassing if you forget the most important things and are lost in all the trivial things which you check off and feel really satisfied by. So, but have you noticed there's like absolutely no end to your to-do list? If you're good at it and you get it all done, you know, you wake up the next morning and there's like a whole other to-do list. And it's like endless. And then so, yeah, you could drop into your grave after 50 years of to-do lists. And that was what Thoreau was saying. Maybe we should investigate what life has to teach us. And the only way you can do that is to inhabit the present moment. When we're not in the future, of course, what's our favorite occupation? You know, being in the past, you know, in memory, you know, the good old days or the bad old days, and then all these narratives, these stories we create about ourselves and why it didn't work out the way it was supposed to and who's to blame for it, because it could certainly not be me. And so we create all these that generate these various narratives. So when you take somebody and you put them in an fMRI scanner and you say, we'd like to ask you to just do nothing in the scanner. Just lie there, and we're going to just kind of look at your brain. It turns out that the brain starts to use enormous amounts of oxygen and ATP, lying there with the instruction to do nothing. Why? Because what do people do in the scanner when they are told to do nothing? They start thinking. And what do they start thinking about? Your most favorite subject. You. Me. A story of me. My future, my past, where I'm going, why it's not working out, why it is working out, what I got to do tomorrow, what I'm missing, how burned out I feel. And it just goes on and on. It turns out it takes an enormous amount of energy, and it's all in what's called the default mode network, in this sort of region of the frontal and prefrontal cortex in the midline. Okay, so this is called its medial region. And that is called, in some studies, the scientists refer to it as the narrative network. It's a representation of self, a mode of self-representation, and it's a story. Now, when you are at your kind of most confident, most secure, most at home in your skin, wouldn't you say that it's usually true that you realize that the story that you generate isn't the real story? It's not totally true. Most of the time we're so in the story that like we have to have it be true, because otherwise, you know, our lives would fall apart. You just have to keep the story going, and the to-do list is part of that. But then when people are trained now in 8 weeks, and this was a study done at the University of Toronto by Norm Farb in Zindel Siegel's lab, and Zindel Siegel is one of the great cognitive therapists and researchers on the planet, who's one of the 3 people who developed what's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for a specific condition which is called major depressive disorder. Not feeling a little depressed or a little blue, but the kind of thing that can hospitalize you for 6 months. And what they actually discovered is that after 8 weeks of MBSR training, that's mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is the parent of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. You don't have to remember all this. But what they see is another region of the brain lighting up. And it's a lateral region. And this region, when they investigate what people's experience is after 8 weeks of training in mindfulness, what they discover is this region is just experiencing yourself in a non-narrative way. It's just like experiencing the fact that, like, you're sitting here breathing. We almost never do that. If you're not choking on a piece of meat or you have a bad cold, what do you care about the breath? You know, it's a ho-hum, one more breath. Of course, when you breathe your last, you usually do care. And if you have a baby, that first breath is like, wow. But in between, it's like, breath, stupid, you know, until you can't take the next. If you're drowning, you know, or even if you, like I sometimes joke with our patients or in corporations when I teach this stuff, you know, say, okay, you think the breath is boring because we could make it the object of attention in the present moment. We could say, I'll give you an assignment. Just ride on the waves, surf on the waves of the sensations of breathing. Since everybody is breathing and you don't have to worry about that, you know, it's taken care of. You didn't put it on your to-do list. Don't forget to breathe. So here it is in the background, just taking care of you. But could you actually bring your attention into your belly or to your nostrils or your chest or wherever the breath sensations are most vivid for you in this moment in your body, and just for a few timeless moments surf or ride on the feeling of the breath coming in and out of your body? And of course you can if you want to. And so let's just actually experience that for a moment or two. You don't even have to adopt a special meditative, holier-than-thou looking posture. Oh, he's so spiritual. Look how he sits. No, you can just you could be hanging upside down from your toes, you know, if you wanted. But still you're breathing. Can you feature that center stage in the field of your awareness, right in this timeless moment we call now? And then stringing a few of those timeless moments together. Because if you check your watch, and you can try this at various times of the day, just check your watch, and you'll see that it's now again. So, riding on the waves of full awareness of this breath coming in, full awareness of this breath leaving the body. And doing it with open-hearted spaciousness, as if, you know, you're not resisting this, why did I sign up for this, and how do I get closer to the door so I can exit gracefully? And this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But just as a kind of experiment, to suspend judgment for a moment, just feel the breath moving in and out. Because at a certain point, you're going to be dead, and the breath won't do this. So right now, it's doing it. Can you be aware of it? Because mindfulness isn't about the breathing. Mindfulness is about the awareness of your experience. So we're just featuring the breath as one of an infinite number of potential objects that we might pay attention to, that we might become aware of, and that might help us embody, you know, sort of ground ourselves in the body in this only moment any of us ever have, to live, to feel, to think, to love, to have an insight. And so this experiential mode of self-referencing is outside of time. It's just this moment, this breath, this sitting here. And this is very foreign to us because we're almost always defaulting. That's why it's called the default mode network in neuroscience. We're defaulting to this. Like when whenever we have a moment, we fall into thought. And in English, we say, we're lost in thought. Underscore the lost. I mean, really lost. Einstein is famous, for having said, and Einstein used thought to an extraordinary degree. His whole theory of relativity and all of his insights came out of what he called Gedanken experiments, thought experiments, Wonder what it would be like to ride at the speed of light on the light beam. And you think about that. But a lot of the time, Einstein said, you're lucky if you have one or two really good thoughts in your entire life. Most of our thoughts are pretty ho-hum. And most of them, when you start to really, how many of you are lawyers? Any of you lawyers in this room? So if you could, even if you're not a lawyer, you can interrogate your thoughts. How true is what I just said, what just crossed my mind? Most of the time, our thoughts are highly inaccurate. They're not true. They would never hold any water in a court of law. But we can believe them for decades. It can ruin our relationships with ourselves, with our children, with our parents, with our lovers. So can you see that no matter how clever our thinking is, if we could cultivate an equally powerful capacity that's inherent to us, that's already ours, which we could call awareness or mindfulness, then we could hold any thought, any emotion, any circumstance arising in our lives and have a new perspective on it because we're adding dimensions to our experience. They're already here, but they're kind of hidden. And what we're doing is we're clarifying them. We're making them come alive for us in a way that ordinarily, since we're zoning along on autopilot and lost in thought so much of the day and in the future, in the past, and in emotional turmoil, we're never grounded in now. And yet now's the only time where we could actually be at home. So to loop back to the corpse pose, you remember what I said about the yoga? They'd say out of all 840,000 yoga postures, that corpse pose is the most difficult. Not standing on your head or doing some kind of elaborate spinal twist, but the corpse pose. Why? Because you got to be willing to die. What does that mean? It means die to the future, die to the past, and wake up to now. Turns out that's easy for me to stand here and say. Turns out it's just about the hardest thing in the world for us human beings to do. So when Thoreau says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what they had to teach. He'd sit in his doorway all day and just watch the sun go by and notice the changing shadows and light in his doorway on the grass and on the pond. Well, Monet is famous for having set up 10 easels in front of the Cathedral of Rouen, and he'd do 10 minutes on this one. The light would be, it'd be a different cathedral. It comes to this one. That's genius. You say, well, anybody could do that. Yeah, but you didn't. But he did. And then he moved to this easel. To front only the essential facts and see if I could not learn what they had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I'd missed the boat, that I hadn't lived. So that seems to me to be kind of a worthy kind of lens to bring to our lives from moment to moment. What happens in this study at the University of Toronto is after 8 weeks of MBSR training, this region lights up, which involves specialized areas of maps of the body and the brain, one of which is called the insula, that's involved in what's called interoception and proprioception. So that when I ask you how you are in the elevator, I see you in the elevator and I say, hi, how are you? And you say, fine. How do you know that? How do you know you're fine? Maybe you're not fine, you're just pretending you're fine because you don't want to get into it in the elevator. But when you say you're fine, that's because there's a sense that will actually allow you to check and see if you're fine or not. That sense is not seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching, the 5 traditional senses. It's called interoception. There's also another sense called proprioception. Like, can you see my hand? I can't, but I know exactly where my hand is. And I could, if I had a piece of food in my hand and I wanted to, I could bring it to my mouth in an infinite number of different ways, and I'd find the center of my mouth every time. You can lose this sense. Read stories of Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist in the United States who writes beautifully about like how we take the body for granted, but that what neurologists see, the kinds of pathology you'd rather die than have some of the kinds of losses that we never think are possible. One of them is you could lose proprioception. So we often ignore the beauty and the vitality of who we are. That's what all this is about. And so it's a kind of invitation, to ask, who am I? It's the deepest of all meditation practices, straight out of the Chinese Chan tradition. What am I? Who am I? And then, of course, the only fair answer, whether you're Einstein or whether you're Newton or whether you're you, is like, tell you the truth, I have no idea. Because, who are you? Are you your name? That was just a skin grafted onto you when you were born by your parents. Shakespeare said a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Maybe would you be the same if you were named Charlie instead of, whatever? Are you your age? Well, that's just the number of times the Earth has gone around our little star in this obscure corner of this obscure galaxy. Are you your gender? Are you your ideas and opinions? Are you your likes and dislikes? Are you your history? It turns out maybe you are to some degree, but when you come down to ideas and opinions, do you have the same ideas and opinions that you had 5 years ago, that you would have died 4 or 5 years ago over those opinions? Now you could care less. Have you noticed that? Sometimes we get really hot around the collar, and then we look back and say, holy smoke, I was really out of my mind during that period of time. So what I'm trying to sort of suggest is that this is non-trivial. This turns out to be the hardest work in the world, the cultivation of mindfulness. It's not like a big hype thing that everybody should be mindful. This is exercising a certain kind of capacity that we're born with, that we ignore for our entire life. When I was, I got asked to give a talk, a breakfast talk, which is a killer. If you're ever asked to talk at breakfast, lunch, or dinner, bad idea. At the Petroleum Club in Alberta, when the oil shale thing was at its absolute height, so everybody's like breathing money, it was like greed, just beyond belief. And they somehow got me as the victim to talk to them in the morning. And about mindfulness, like as if they cared or wanted to know or would it be any of use to them. But of course they're human beings and they're breathing and they have love and they have fear and they have suffering. And so, I just took it at face value. But I tried to look for some kind of metaphor that might help them, sort of like, said, you are all in the oil business, right? And it's like, yeah, so you drill or you do this fracking or whatever it is the hell that you do, or filtering the shale oil sands. You're drawing out deep, hidden interior resources from the earth. Okay, so what mindfulness is tapping into your own deep, hidden interior resources inside yourself for learning, for growing, for healing, and for transformation that are part and parcel of your being human. It's not like you have to get these deep interior resources. They exist. But if we ignore them, we can't benefit from raising them, so to speak. And so you can go through, as Thoreau was saying, your whole life, miss the boat. And if you are at work, it's like very common in work settings where, the corporations go into collective delusion. And they forget what their mission is. They forget what their work is. And the more competitive the work environment, which is getting so competitive now, especially in digital and IT domains and everything else, that in very short order you can go from the top to the bottom. And these young 20-year-olds that don't even wear clothes, can like wipe you out. It's not true. They do wear clothes, but they dress differently. So the question is, can we bring awareness to what we're doing collectively as a organization that has values and a mission and goals, and for the EU, I mean, lofty. I mean, I consider, from the point of view of America and Americans, so I don't know anything about the EU. You know how ignorant Americans can be. I embody that around the EU, okay? But at the same time, I've always appreciated the EU and the Euro and what you have tried to do to dissolve boundaries and borders as actually a commitment to enlightenment, okay? An embodied in the body politic commitment to enlightenment after 1,000 years of warfare among neighbors. And how are we going to move into the 20th and 21st century and prevent those kinds of tendencies from becoming so dominant that they become the default mode, killing each other, fearing each other, harming each other, denying each other's humanity? And of course, that's as true today with what's happening in the Mediterranean or what's happening in Ukraine or anywhere else as it was during the 100 Years' War. So the question is, what is the nature of the human mind and the human heart? And can we, in some sense, embody and then instantiate in our institutions, in our businesses, in our calling as a kind of more pan-European or global way of maintaining sanity and humanity, can we actually optimize our capacity for doing good and for not causing harm? And in order to do that, we have to deal with that question of who am I? Because if those people coming from Africa who don't look anything like me but are winding up in my village in Sweden or in Germany, I mean, if I don't recognize their humanity because I feel threatened myself, what the hell am I going to do? I'm going to burn down the thing that they're building to house these people and put swastikas on it. And it's like, what's that coming from? It's coming out of fear. It's coming out of a human emotion that everybody has because we've been, in some sense, tribal for most of human history. So it's us against them. And we better get them before they get us. So the EU is a countervailing force for that to me is a force for enlightenment. I mean, a force for goodness, for kindness, for intelligence at a multiplicity of governmental and economic and social levels that would actually help elevate us to what it really means to be human. Okay? Homo sapiens sapiens, we call ourselves. The species that knows and knows that it knows. From the Latin sapere, if you remember, which means to taste or to know. But when you taste something, it's not like, if you taste the banana, it's not like you know everything about the banana, but it's not like you read the encyclopedia of bananas. The knowing is a direct taste, direct experience. So it's not cognition, it's more awareness. So we're the species, we gave ourselves this name, the species that is aware and is aware that we're aware. And I don't think so. We're still relatively young as a species. If you think back, all of human history is like just since the end of the last ice age. Okay, so how many years is that? I mean, if you want to go back to Sumeria, what's it, 5,000 years, 6,000 years, 8,000 years? So if you do the math at, let's say, the generations every 30 years, that might be 600 generations, 700 generations. That's nothing. We grow that many generations in a test tube of bacteria overnight in the lab. But, that's nothing. That's like in its infancy. We, as a species, are in our infancy. But the question is, can we rise to the occasion of the level of suffering in the world now and the level of ignorance and the level of greed, where like bankers start to try to figure out really, really clever ways that are like not exactly illegal, that can suck all the money out of Europe and put it in high-risk derivatives around the housing market in the United States, where we're selling houses to people that the bankers actually know that people can't possibly afford to pay for. Whoa, that sounds like a fantastic investment opportunity for some small village in Norway. What a great idea. Or for Ireland, to put so much into that kind of thing. And now it's not housing anymore, it's used cars. I mean, there's like no end to the creativity, to the criminal creativity, driven by greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed, let's not call it hatred, greed, aversion, and ignorance. So, and it's not all them bankers on Wall Street either. It's us. If we think it's all project out onto the others, whoever the bad guys are, that those are the ones, or the problem employees, or whoever you want to assign as like the reason that you're being thwarted, and you don't include yourself, you don't recognize that, hey, maybe you're also driven to some degree by desire, by greed, more for me, optimize my well-being at the expense of others. Aversion, like there's some things I just don't want to go anywhere near, maybe emotionally, maybe physically or whatever. And then ignorance, like I actually am ignoring major segments of reality. Again, Thoreau. And then at the end, you realize, holy smoke, I was in some kind of hypnotic trance for most of my life. I don't even know who my children are. I wasn't even there for them. I was so busy working. Do you know what I'm talking about? And then they'll be happy to tell you 20 years from now, Dad, you were never there. You have this nice narrative about what a great father you were, but you were never there. You had no idea who I was, what I cared about. Why? Because you weren't paying attention. So there's almost no human arena where a little mindfulness might not go an awfully long way. And let me say that in all Asian languages, the word for mind and word for heart is the same word. So when you hear the word mindfulness, if you're not, in some sense, also decoding it at the level of your bones and your genes and your ears as heartfulness, you're not understanding it. This is not some kind of cold, clinical, thought-based anything. It's awareness-based. And awareness is like this gold mine or oil field that we've never got any schooling in, never pointed out to us in most cases. That's what's been going on for hundreds and thousands of years in monasteries, in Asia mostly, but even there, it's a vast minority of the people who ever take that seriously and actually do the work to transform the mind, to develop greater insight, greater compassion, greater kindness, greater generosity, greater non-separation of self and other, deep insight into the nature of who you are, that you're not who you think you are, that actually whoever is doing the awarenessing is just infinitely bigger than the narrative in this default mode network. That's liberative. And it doesn't happen like after 50 years of meditating. It can happen in 50 seconds, in no time. As soon as you're willing to drop in, again, it wasn't the breath that was important, although we rode on the waves of the breath. It's not the objects of attention, it's the attending. Can we actually be present at work, even for a minute, never mind a day? It's a non-trivial challenge. Can you feel how this might be relevant in some way to the calling of the institution and also to the quality of your own life, especially if you've got more work to do than you can possibly do and you're feeling like strained and burned out and it's like juggling, and now they give me a few more balls to juggle and I'm not supposed to drop any and I'm being evaluated on the basis of how many balls I drop? And then it's not so easy to go home under lots of stress because you bring the stress home with you. And then, of course, everybody else has stress too, but you're so preoccupied with your stress that you can't even hear what's going on with the other people in the family. And it's not necessarily always so happy, even though it was love that started it all. And I'm purposefully kind of being a little bit provocative and trying to stretch the envelope, because what really I'm inviting you to do is not take anything I'm saying at face value, but to inquire yourself, does this make any sense? And if it does, it's not a theory, it's not a philosophy, it's a practice. Or if you want to use the Latin, because I think a lot of businesses like to talk about praxis. Something special about it if we call it praxis. But what it is it's like, it's not a technique, it's a way of being. And the only moment that you could instantiate it or incorporate it is now. So to come back to the 5 senses or the 7 senses, and the Buddhists would say that awareness itself is a sense. So if I wanted to, I could show you a movie. How many of you have seen the gorilla basketball movie? Anybody seen that? See, I can't show it anymore because everybody's seen it. But how many of you don't know what I'm talking about? Okay, so I'm sorry I didn't bring my laptop. So this famous experiment where you get a brief movie on the screen, okay? And there are 3 people in white T-shirts and 3 people in black T-shirts, and each team has a basketball, and they're passing it around to each other as they're walking around like this, okay? And before I play the movie, I tell you that I give you an assignment. Your job is to count the number of times the people in the white shirts will pass the basketball before the movie's over, and the movie's going to end in less than a minute. So everybody got it? Yeah, we got it. Okay, play, push play, and people are counting the number of times the basketball's past the white shirts. Okay. Now, what they don't see at the 90% level, when I've done this with groups of thousands of people, and at a 90, 85% level, what they don't see is that a person in a gorilla suit walks right through these 6 people who are passing the basketballs, turns right to the camera, goes like this, and then walks off this way. And you don't see it. You don't see it. And when I say, okay, now, I'll say, well, okay, give me the number of times the people in the white shirts pass the basketball. And you know what you get? This is among very smart people who have PhDs and MDs and work for the EU and everything else. And you get a Poisson distribution. We can't even count. We can't say, not everybody doesn't say, yeah, 14. It's like some people say 14, some people say 15, some people say 16, some people say 13, some people say 12. A few outliers say 11 or 17. So it's like you take a room full of 1,000 people who have been trained in the best universities, and it's not like they all come up with the right number. So then I ask them the next question. Any of you notice anything unusual during this whole movie? And, a few people will, say, well, most don't. Okay, now I'm going to push play again, and now I'll give you another assignment. Just watch the movie. Don't count anything. And lo and behold, you can hear. And I said, do it 100% in silence. Because what you hear when people see the gorilla is like a collective gasp. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. And then they start to say things like, you switched movies on us. I say, no, I didn't switch movies on you. It's like, it's obvious what happened, right? I gave you an assignment. Count the number of times that people in the white shirts pass the basketball. Well, we're really good at, taking orders. And actually wanting to succeed, because you immediately you sort of ricocheted back or rocketed back to your school days, and you think, I'm being tested. I got to perform on this. I'm going to bloody well get the right number. So you've got like a fixation on what you think the challenge is. Is this beginning to sound a little familiar about work? You can fixate on what you think the challenge is. Meanwhile, somebody's walking through your whole thing in a gorilla suit and then turning and going like this and moving by. Now, it's obvious what happened. The brain is so good at saying, like, the problem is white. Follow the white. Don't be distracted by anything that's not white, therefore tune out everything black. Well, it turns out the brain's really good at that. And someplace between, now the gorilla, as you know, the images that come into the eyes are inverted by the lenses. So you've got two gorillas, one on each retina, upside down, and then someplace between the images of the gorilla on your retinas and the occipital cortex, which decodes it and puts everything right and allows us to all be in the same room, although we're all in different rooms, someplace it gets hijacked because you have this other aim that you think is what it's all about. So it's kind of like a mistake. You've mistaken, or you've been taken by the way I set it up, so that you think this is the problem, whereas there's kind of a much bigger field that if you were aware of, you'd see something very interesting. Now, if you're in business or if you're in politics, there are gorillas all over the place. And a lot of the time, we don't see them until it's too late, and then you have to fix the problem. So the mind can not see what's right in front of our eyes. Often like the suffering of another or the beauty of another. If we are conditioned, the person looks like me, I might feel empathy, or my altruism might be more in evidence. The person doesn't look like me and they want to move in next to me, and there's 20 of them and we've never had black people in our village before, other emotions come up. Are they understandable? Yes. Are they human? Yes. The question is how to be in relationship with them. If you are in one form of relationship to them, then you want to actually harm the other because you feel so disregarded, so hurt, so threatened. But if you hold the thing in awareness and you recognize our common humanity, then you might, as most people I think do in Europe, actually make space. But this is a key issue now in all of Europe, right? But it's really an issue of the nature of our minds and the nature of our hearts and how we will develop policies that will in some sense educate ourselves, grow ourselves into what's possible without stretching the envelope so much that you'll get just a lot of violence and resentment and so forth. Now, I can't say any more than that because I don't know that much about Europe and European politics, but if you were a black person, a black male in the United States in the past 6 months, but actually white people now know that if you're a black male in the United States, and you look wrong at a cop, you're likely to be shot down on the street. Okay? It's been going on for well over 100 years, but now we've had such a spate of it but the black people, they've known that for well over 100 years, 200 years. Like, it's different in the United States with full citizenship as an African-American male, especially between the ages of 15 and 40, that you are in dangerous territory just going down the street, never mind going into some neighborhood where you're not known. This is in the United States of America, sort of the land of the free and the home of the brave. So it's not like, I've come here to point fingers at Europe. I think we have a collective challenge as a species that we need to grow into that meaning, deep meaning of Homo sapiens sapiens, and embody it in our institutions and in how we live our own lives and how we raise our children. And no one knows how to do that. It's not like I've come here and tell you, well, I got this all down, I had a dream and it's all like, this is how we do it. No, we need all of us to collectively contribute to this inquiry. And that actually happens a lot at work. If you know the work of Peter Senge and Otto Sharma and the Theory U and so forth, the organization for, it's called the Society for Organizational Learning at MIT, they are pioneers at bringing mindfulness into the workplace in these kinds of ways and actually galvanizing people to transform their relationship or their relationality to very, very challenging problems in the business world, in the corporate world, in the larger world. And there's a hunger for this, because I think more and more we've reached the point where, well, how many more cars do you want, or a bigger house, or whatever? I think that we are collectively starving in the first world for how empty, for meaning, for, how empty it can feel when we have everything and we feel like we have nothing and we don't even know who we are when we wake up in the middle of the night. And our narratives don't work for us anymore. And what this invitation for mindfulness is to actually cultivate a muscle that's already here, but this needs to be nurtured, nourished. And when we do that, then our thinking and our capacity for emotion gets both amplified and refined, so that we can optimize the potential for well-being and kindness in the world, and minimize the potential for violence, harm, and so forth. If we don't visit that in our own selves, then projecting it out onto others is not going to be that useful. Now, this book that you've all been handed out, and I have to say, I'm just very moved that David and his team here actually came up with this idea. This one was not my idea, to give you all a copy of my book, especially an 800-page copy or something like that. Works very well as a doorstop, to hold the door open. But it's called Coming to Our Senses, and that's a kind of play on words in English, because the only way you can actually know who you are is to come to your senses. In other words, seeing what's here to be seen, including all the gorillas that you could easily miss. Hearing what's here to be heard. Have you ever been at home and somebody who really deeply loves you says, "You never listen to me"? It happens in relationships. Why? Because, we tune out very, very easily. And we often hurt most the people that we love the most out of ignorance. Again, do you know what I'm talking about, or am I way far away from you? Okay. So, seeing, hearing, smelling, the fragrance of the air. A lot of the time we're too busy. We can't smell the smells of spring. We don't see the tulips. We don't see the flowering trees, or the blossom, the leaves unfolding, or whatever it is that we're kind of zoning along on autopilot, and all of our moments are unavailable to us. But you can, in no time, come back to your senses. When you're eating, try tasting. You have to remind yourself, because we eat so mechanically, that you can eat a whole meal and then not even know that you ate it. Never mind, how did even one bite taste? So we do a little exercise. Maybe you've done it, because I love that this talk is part of a whole day here of mindfulness practices and so forth, as I understand it, and also a commitment that's going to go way beyond today. But in the first class in the 8-week MBSR program in the hospital, very early on in the class, we give every one of our medical patients who have cancer, heart disease, AIDS, chronic pain, some people paralyzed from the neck down or from the waist. I mean, you're talking about humans suffering at inconceivable levels, all in the same room, and we give people 2 raisins. So they've come, to deal with their life issues, and what do? We give them 2 raisins. And then we have them put one aside and just take about 15 minutes to eat one. To actually see it. Just look at it for 5 minutes. Do we ever do that, I mean, just pay that quality of attention to what we're going to put in our mouth, and bring it up close and be aware of how the miracle of this. How many of you have children? Anybody here have children? They're too busy. So remember when they were 8 months old, 9 months old, 10 months old, when they were feeding themselves, the food would go everywhere, be all over blueberries, all over the face, all over the body, right, all over the floor. It's it's not so easy. We have to actually, it's a learning trajectory before we can land the food right square and center. We don't appreciate that at all, but it's a beautiful skill, same as walking. Nobody learns to walk by reading the manual on how to do it. And no parent has ever said, let me sit you down now, you 6-month-old, and I will tell you how to pull yourself up on the couch and then begin to sort of move out into the free domain of the living room. No, we discover that for ourselves. And no one reaches adulthood and, opts for a wheelchair because it's too embarrassing to fall down in front of those adults that are always laughing at you. And so it's too humiliating, so I'll just opt for a wheelchair. No, we are geniuses. We're like miraculous beings being human. We see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, and we don't know how we do any of that. If it, I asked you to follow your breathing, right? To ride on the waves of your breathing. So, and I use the word your breathing. But frankly, if it were up to you to do the breathing, you would have died a long time ago. You would have gotten distracted. Whoops, forgot to breathe, dead. So the brainstem and the phrenic nerve and what controls your breathing, the diaphragm, you're not allowed anywhere near the breathing apparatus. You can't commit suicide by holding your breath. Yes, you can hold your breath, but you can't auto-suicide by holding your breath. Because it's not allowed in the biological rule book. And again, nowhere. You just can't get anywhere near the heart. You're just not responsible enough. And the liver, forget it. If you were in charge of your liver for 30 seconds, you'd rather be in control of a Boeing 747 trying to land than in charge of your liver for 30 seconds. But when was the last time you thanked your liver for what it's doing? We take so much for granted, it's unbelievable. And that's just the body. So mindfulness is a way to come back into the full dimensionality of living. Okay? Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, proprioception, interoception, awareness. And then, when all is said and done, I would say that what this really is, it's a very arduous meditation practice. It's also a radical act of love. It's a radical act of sanity and we're going to stop here and maybe practice a tiny little bit more and then have Q&A. But if I take my seat in the morning before I do anything else, I wake up, maybe brush my teeth, splash water on my face, and I'll sit. So rather than jump into doing, how about dropping into being? You can do it lying down. I mean, there are a million different doors into the present moment. Formal meditation practices. But it's all about the awareness. It's not about the technique. There are millions of techniques. I don't even like to use the word technique. They're ways of being. Okay, so can we be present just sitting? In this moment, in this timeless moment. And nothing has to happen. It's not like, now what am I supposed to feel? I know this meditation stuff is good, so what is the special feeling that if I felt that, then I know it was really good? Otherwise, it's just a waste of time. So let's flip that on its head. Like, instead of looking for something special to feel, recognizing that your capacity to feel anything at all is totally special. So now, what's happening is the curriculum. Feeling bored? How about bringing awareness to boredom? To the mind state of, like, this is so boring, I want something else to happen. Which brings me back to the breath. You can do this yogic manipulation if you think that it's like boring to ride on the waves of your breath for 5 minutes. And I'm busy and you don't understand how important I am at the you, so I'm not going to do this stupid breathing thing. So if, like, you can do this little yogic experiment. You take your thumb and push it really hard over one nostril. You take your middle finger and squeeze it over the other nostril. You put your index finger on the bridge of your nose. You purse your lips together and you see just how long it takes before the next in-breath is the only thing in the world that you care about. And it will be under a minute. So we ignore and take for granted and dismiss some of the deepest, most valuable aspects of our lives. And you see, it's possible. What mindfulness is about is inhabiting that space. It takes no time. We're already here, right? Can we be here 100%? If somebody is in front of you, can you drink them in? Not like, let's see, now I'm going to meditate on you. No, but just like another human being. If that human being is suffering, can you actually, through the mirror neurons, recognize this is like the biological basis of empathy, that when that person's suffering, very often circuits in their brain that are firing are mirrored by circuits in your brain. The same circuits are firing. It's thought of as the biological basis of empathy. Facial expression does that. Gestures of one kind or another do it. Our hearts resonate together. So, but if you're not aware of that, then you might miss the suffering in the other. If that person works for you, you probably don't have an optimal relationship if they can't see you seeing them and recognizing their value. That alone would be like an incredible act of leadership, kindness, wisdom, enlightenment, fill in the blank, whatever word you want. You are present enough for the other and to invite them wordlessly to actually show up 100%. We want a workforce that shows up 100%, that cares. So this dropping in can be trivialized and, sort of very, very easily. Dropping into the present moment is like an art form. And then, in formal practice, you just, come to your senses. So one of them would be just the sense of the breath moving in and out of the body. That's a very good place to start. But remember, it's not about the breath, it's about the awareness. So you could do it seeing, you could do it tasting the raisin, you could do it seeing what's in front of you, hearing sounds. There's nothing that in the sensory world that you couldn't use as an object of attention, but they're all different doors into the same room, and that room is heartfulness, mindfulness, awareness. And you do it with extraordinary kindness and self-compassion, because this is really hard. And if you exercise that muscle regularly, daily, because your life depends on it, which I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it did, and probably you wouldn't be here if you didn't suspect in some way that it might be of some value, then enact that and give it a chance, like 8 weeks or 8 years, and then I'll come back to the EU and we'll see what happens. Meanwhile, I've given you this brick of a book, or I didn't give it to you, but in that book, is the whole practice come at in a lot of different ways. So it's not like you should sit down and read the whole book, but if you just open it almost at random, there may be things there that might spark some kind of connection with what I have said here and you've experienced here today that will nurture this. And then if you draw on the resources that seem to be increasingly available at the EU in terms of courses, in terms of mindfulness trainings of one kind or another, the textbook hasn't been written on what the EU might be capable of doing if it really became the full came into the full dimensionality of the vision of the EU. Now, not just the vision, but in some sense embodied, where everybody was so enlivened by it, no matter what country they were from, that they wanted to contribute to it in ways that are truly unimaginable until they start to happen. Which is what Peter Senge and Nader Sharma and Theory U is all about. It's not like you can script this. It's a love affair with life and with meaning and purpose and with potential, with possibility. So that's what it is. If it sounds like a lot, it's only because it's a lot. And but it's doable. Millions of people. I mean, I was just in Holland for 10 days, and I can't tell you the number of people who came up to me, and that I've never met, and who said, "You've changed my life," or "Mindfulness saved my life." And I never get tired of that. And I know what they mean because I've spent 36 years doing this at the University Hospital, and I see it happening. But it's not like I'm changing anybody's life or saving anybody's life. They are saving their own life. They're recovering the domain of possibility instead of just living out your life step by step until you drop into your grave. There's a beautiful poem, and I'm going to stop here and then we'll have conversation. There's a beautiful poem by a Nobel laureate from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, an Afro-Caribbean writer named Derek Walcott. Maybe you've heard of him. He did win the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he writes very long poems. And this is a short poem of Derek Walcott's. And think of all of the ways in which you ignore certain aspects of your own being, or put them on hold because you got to climb this ladder, or get to this kind of statistic in your life, or this milestone, or whatever it is. Maybe there are times when you put other aspects on hold, or you've been hurt so deeply that you don't want to go to other places again. You say, I'll never do that. Happens in love affairs, you know, like teenage love. The first teenage love, it happens, you feel destroyed, and you say, I'll never let myself feel that vulnerable again because it's just too painful. So I'm going to actually give you two poems, I thought. Never mind, we'll put Derek Walcott over here for a second, and we're going to go with one of our greatest poets in America, Emily Dickinson, who's really hard to understand. And so I hesitate to do this, except since it's the EU, all you people speak English well enough, you know, they're probably far better than I do. But you have to really listen, because she uses the English language in a way nobody did before or after. But it's very short. And again, a large part of it's about personal pronouns. So let me just say something about personal pronouns. Mindfulness of personal pronouns can itself be a very profoundly liberating experience. And the Buddha is famous for having said, remember the Buddha is the most articulate expression of mindfulness in the human world, in history. The Buddha is famous for having said at the end of his life, when he taught for 45 years, virtually nonstop, teaching mindfulness, teaching compassion, teaching meditation, embodied, lived. He said, all my teaching can be encapsulated in one sentence. And I like to say, on the off chance that the Buddha wasn't just joking, maybe we should memorize that sentence. You know, it's like all of Buddhism in like one sentence. Cool. And the sentence is, nothing is to be clung to. The verb to cling, to attach, to self-identify as I, me, or mine. So it loops right back to, who am I? Who am I? What do I even mean when I say I or me? My body. Who has your body? Who says my body? Who's that? My mind. Who's that? I'm trying to provoke you to sort of like, in a loving way, to sort of inquire, like, are you who you think you are, or are you much, much faster than that? So this is Emily Dickinson. Remember the personal pronouns, because they feature large in this poem. Me, from myself, to banish, had I art, impregnable my fortress unto all heart. Okay, so I'm never going to let myself be this vulnerable again because it's too painful. Me, from myself, to banish, had I art, if I could possibly do that, impregnable my fortress unto all heart. But since myself assault me, how have I peace, except by subjugating consciousness? And since we're mutual monarch, how this be, except by abdication, me of me. Monarch means like king, queen. So since we're mutual monarch, me and myself, how this be, except by abdication, me of me. We do that a lot. We abdicate large swaths of ourselves to fit in, to be a good girl, to be a good boy, to be a good citizen, to be a good boss. But are we really a good boy or a good girl or a good boss if we're not integrated and whole? Okay, so that's the painful side of it, is this kind of fragmentation. Here's Derek Walcott now. The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door. In your own mirror. And each will smile at the others, welcome, and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to yourself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, who you have ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes, the past. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit. Feast on your life. That's what this is. It's feasting on life. There are an infinite number of ways to do it. I'm not telling you how to do it. It got 800 pages of different doors into it if you want them, or it works as a good doorstop. But if anything that brought you here to this meeting this morning resonates with you when you leave this room, trust it and water those seeds and see what happens. It feels like an enormous privilege for me personally to just come here and be with you for this short period of time. I can feel your presence. And when all is said and done, that's what it's about, is waking up, being present, being fully embodied in this moment without being so distracted by our agendas that we're always grasping after some future that we have to have in order to be whole, and pushing away all the wolves at the door and the disasters, and then we're like completely off balance and we're just gonna burn out. And no good for anybody. And the world doesn't need that. The EU doesn't need that. Your boss doesn't need that. Your family doesn't need that, and you don't need that. So what's the alternative? Human creativity. It all comes out of the heart, the mind, the body. Are those three separate things? The world, four separate things? I don't think so. So I want to thank you for your attention, and now let's have a conversation. And if we go beyond 2, those of you who want to stay beyond 2, I will stay a little bit longer. I've spoken longer than I wanted to, but you never know what's going to happen until you do it. So I'm not going to regret what I did, but I hope that we have an occasion to actually converse some at this point. So anybody... Thank you. And thank you all of you who are not in this room but out there. Again, the same thing applies. If any of this has been meaningful to you, just investigate it. Well, I'm not here to sell anything. I'm just here to tell you what mindfulness is, you know, at its heart. It's not a technique. It's not some dime store thing, you know, that's like becoming incredibly popular. That will kill it. And it's too important to kill. And so that means that if any of this makes sense, it's in some sense your responsibility to live your life as if it really mattered in the only moment you're ever going to get. So please, yes. And somebody's going to bring a microphone around so that people on the internet can, or elsewhere in the world, can hear.
Hi. In the last 10 years or so, it seems to me that people's lack of attention to the present moment has been made very visible by people fiddling with smartphones on all possible occasions.
You're not kidding.
Do you think that it is getting more difficult to pay attention to what we're actually doing? Or, in fact, maybe we've always been good at distracting ourselves, it's just that when you have a smartphone, it's more obvious to everyone else that you're doing it?
I think it's qualitatively different. I think that the degree of distractibility is pathological at this point. And so it becomes a really interesting mindfulness exercise to notice how often you want to check your phone. To notice the emotion, the feeling, the sort of greediness, the kind of like, I'm not even okay unless I find out how the rest of the world is feeling about me. There's a woman at MIT named Sherry Turkle who writes books about this kind of thing. And it's having vast implications in the social networks, especially among young people, but all of us are like perpetually distracted. So the phone and the impulse to check it, and the impulse to always be in connection with, you can be in connection with the entire world and not at all in connection with yourself. What kind of connection is that? What kind of connectivity? Or you may have to call yourself up at a certain point. Hello, John? Are you breathing? Are you in your body? Are you tasting your food? Do you feel the air on your skin? And then you're going to get a bill from the phone company. You don't need the phone. You can just drop in. And then, of course, how many of us would surrender our phones? Not me. I mean, we can't live with this stuff and we can't live without this stuff. I work a lot with people who invented these things. I work a lot with people in Silicon Valley who come to mindfulness retreats, the people that brought you the iPhone. I mean, really, that designed the iPhone and the iPad, and you know, and people in Silicon Valley who are inventing, you know, all these companies, and they understand the value of mindfulness, and Steve Jobs didn't let his kids anywhere near those devices. Seriously. Because there's a kind of developmental trajectory where, you know, the kids start in on computers now at 6 months old. Who knows what that's doing to the nervous system? And, you know, it's like kind of uncontrolled experiment. It's going to happen. But what do you want for you? Because you can't control anybody else. And you can't even control your kids, you know. But you can sort of titrate some of this so that childhood there may still be some possibility of living in an analog world, even though it probably sounds like a Luddite for me to say it. So yeah, it's a deep challenge, but then you can use this technology. That's the beauty of mindfulness, is you can bring mindfulness to anything. So to the addictive qualities, or, you know, and I'm sure you don't do that, but a lot of people, they post on Facebook all the time, and then they're insanely preoccupied with what other people are saying about what they posted on Facebook. And they don't feel complete without it. And they don't use the telephone, by the way. They only text because they don't really want that kind of intimacy. The telephone is too intimate. It might be just catching somebody at the wrong moment. Seriously, I mean, the whole world is like transforming in front of our very eyes. And remember when I did that calculation about how many generations there have been since human history? Well, the generations are now like not 30 years apart, they're 3 years apart. I mean, 16-year-olds and the 13-year-olds, they live in different universes, they don't listen to the same music, they don't live in the same reality. So, you know, it's a big adventure being human in this era. I think the potential for creativity is awesome, never better, but it requires our full genius to show up while we still can. Anybody else? Yes, please.
First, to tell you, everything you said is extremely meaningful, but picking on this, would you have any advice on how to develop awareness in the youngsters, adolescents, kids?
Well, yes. My colleague Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, who's a very highly regarded neuroscientist and actually one of the inventors, the founders of the field of what's called affective neuroscience, in other words, the neuroscience of emotion. And not just emotions like anxiety and depression, but emotions like compassion and kindness, has multi-million-dollar grant studying the effects of a mindfulness-based training in kindness and mindfulness in 5 and 6-year-olds. So a highly rigorous research study in collaboration with the Madison, Wisconsin Public Schools. And mindfulness is moving into public education in the United States and private education in the United States like nobody's business, because the teachers are going out of their minds. Because the children, very often in the United States, they're coming to school and they're not ready to learn. A lot of them haven't even had breakfast. And a lot of them have experienced violence before they, you know, got to school. And a lot of them have seen their relatives gunned down in the streets. Okay, so this is like a real part of our reality. And the teachers, they can't. So you could think of mindfulness as like, since a lot of it has to do paying attention, and teachers really want their students to pay attention, because otherwise how are you going to absorb the curriculum? Mindfulness is like tuning the instrument of learning. Before you can learn, you have to tune the instrument. You have to learn how to attend. So there's an enormous application for mindfulness in education. And if you Google mindfulness in education, you will be overwhelmed by the number of programs here in the UK and elsewhere. Just genius programs, Mindfulness in Schools in the UK.org. In the US, in Oakland, which is one of the sort of most difficult, challenging school districts in the country, Mindful Schools. They train thousands of teachers in this kind of thing because we're trying to help the children to understand what it means to be human, to have a body, to have a mind. And sometimes the teachers will do this. I've been in classrooms where half the kids have attention deficit disorder, the teacher tells us, or are on the Asperger's spectrum, or even have, sort of autism. And they'll ring some bells. I've seen this happen in the classroom. Let's say with six-year-olds. And we're sitting in the back of the classroom, and as this happens, you see hands go up. First just one or two, and then more and more and more. What you don't know, unless you were there when they started doing this, is that what the teacher's doing is they're ringing the bell, and then you raise your hand when you can't hear it anymore. So soon the whole class has their hand up. But while they are listening for not being able to hear the bell, total silence. Class full of kids with ADD and ADHD. Totally silent. They're learning how to drop in and be in their body and actually regulate their emotions so that the impulse to reach out and punch you in the face, which I might have just because whatever, some random firing in my brain, I actually recognize that impulse and I don't do it. Kids are learning this kind of thing. It's the foundation of emotional intelligence. So this is becoming a big movement, not just in the US, but in the UK, and I know in France, and in Holland. I was just spent, as I said, I was at a conference on mindfulness in education yesterday. Hundreds of people, teachers, and, sort of bringing this into the classroom and also researching it. I'll say one other thing, because you're the EU before, and we'll continue if you want to, but the Parliament in the UK, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but the Parliament in the UK has had over 120 members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons already go through an 8-week mindfulness program, modeled more or less on MBSR, including Lord Richard Layard, who's one of the great macroeconomists at the London School of Economics, and his wife. And there's a waiting list to get into these courses, which is extraordinary. That's the Parliament in the UK. The Dutch Parliament is also training in this. The Swedish Parliament is also training in this. So I have some kind of hope, and that's the last thing I'll say about coming to our senses. There's 100 pages in there about the body politic, about how mindfulness might actually be relevant to politics, to social policy, to all of that kind of stuff. So that's one of the reasons that I'm so happy that you'll at least carry that book away, and if you care to, dip into it from time to time. Anybody else want to ask anything before we close? Yes, or say anything. You don't have to ask, but...
There have been a number of articles in The Economist and the Financial Times to say that they find that big companies picking up the whole idea of mindfulness and sort of pushing it is rather creepy. What do you think about
why?
that?
They're all human beings. Facebook, Google, it could easily be denatured. It could easily be commodified. It could easily be destroyed by all of those forces that are always, when something gets popular in the mainstream, destroys it. But I can tell you that the people at Google and the people at Facebook and the people at Twitter and the people, at all of those Silicon Valley companies and the people at Ford Motor Company and all sorts of other non-IT-based companies, they're into transformation. This is not about some dime store thing about stress reduction. Yes, there's a lot of stress in the work setting, but they're not just into helping their workforce be happier and healthier. They're interested in finding new ways to work that work. The irony is, and we say it in English, work isn't working anymore. We need to find new, more imaginative, more human, more mindful, more heartful ways to actually work and create cultures where we actually contribute to the transformation of the world. And I don't mean that as some kind of slogan or nice fiddling, while Rome burns. I mean diving deeply, tapping deeply into those interior resources for learning, for growing, for healing, for transformation, that are what defines us as Homo sapiens sapiens. And that's what's coming to our senses is all about, if you read it. Yeah.
Hello, I work for the European Parliament, and we don't have mindfulness courses so far. Maybe this is the first one.
Well, you never know, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the question what it means to be human. And how do we apply this to the collective mind? Because there is a guy called John Gray, I'm sure you heard about him. John Gray, who actually, he says that the history of humanity is the history of greed, violence, and tribal behavior. And
well, that's part of the history.
What we're doing here, we're working on the individual level with everybody, yeah? On mindfulness.
No, also on the collective social level.
Exactly, that's my question.
Yeah.
How do you apply it to collective mind?
Any way you can. Seriously, I mean, any way you can. Let's not be dualistic about it and say, well, there's the individual mind and there's the collective mind. You're all working for one body, whether it's a corporation or whether it's the EU. It's a body. It's a collection of human beings who care. You could say even, without getting too far out about it, who love it. I'm sure you could all get jobs doing something else, and you love, in some sense, the sort of mission of the EU, if not the corporate, bureaucracy of it. But how can that be optimized? How could it be transformed? So I don't know the answer to that. You probably don't know the answer. You probably don't. But when we get together and we start to inquire together, then a kind of greater intelligence emerges that is larger than the whole of its parts. And there's evidence for that. It's not, I'm just talking through the top of my head. There's evidence for that. But it requires us to be more fully human than we sometimes give ourselves credit for being.
So my point was that the moment people get together,
Yeah.
that this violent and sort of greedy behavior prevails.
Well, but you can bring awareness to your own impulse to be violent and greedy. Because I suggested, I was the one that said, it's not just those other bankers, who are greedy, that we're greedy too. But what if you hold your greed, those impulses for more for me, or like my career is the most important thing, or my success, or my paycheck, and you are aware of that, and you hold it in awareness, and you see the toxicity of that, or you see that like maybe that route you'll never be satisfied because you'll always want more. So that is wisdom. That's the cultivation of wisdom. I see people transforming and choosing to work for less money with greater satisfaction because there's, say, more love or whatever you want to call it. So I see that as like not some pie-in-the-sky romanticism or idealism, but actually the new way of doing business, the new way of working. But it requires us to take a level of responsibility for the whole that a lot of the time we don't do because we feel very sort of, those personal pronouns catch us up. And the violence piece, it's not about pretending we're not violent as human beings or tribal. It's recognizing how violent and tribal we are and then realizing that our awareness isn't violent and our awareness is not tribal. And therefore, it's like a new degree of freedom and intelligence for actually solving very, very real problems at the level of human beings, at the level of policy, at the level of, our relationship to the resources on the planet, human and otherwise. We'll take one more or two more. Yeah. Mathieu.
So thank you, John. Maybe I just want to bring one thing from the Day of Practitioners,
Please.
which is happening in the European Commission at the moment today, so people are watching us, but especially having heard that nothing is happening in the European Parliament, for example. I think actually a lot of activities related to mindfulness are happening in the European Commission quite a lot, but also in the European Parliament and other institutions. And part of preparing for this day of practice has been making that more visible and compiling this list of activities. So I just wanted to speak that, and of course that's something that we can share with the Open School Administration, which can be distributed to all participants of today, so that you can start to see that actually a lot of training cycles, whether MBSR, MBCD, or other forms of mindfulness-based practice, have been organized. There are regular practitioners sessions every week happening in some Director Generals and services, and people are starting to find themselves in different ways. So today may have been an input and stimulus from you, John, and supported by the school, but it's also for whoever would like to actually go into real practice yourself and learning about this. Know that there's a lot available out there, obviously. And it takes different forms, and it's organized in different ways in different services, depending on what's there, what are the needs, what are the possibilities. And I would just like to say one last thing is that as senior managers, you may also want to sponsor some learning activities linked to this, not just attend them for yourself, which could be great, but you may actually, if you care to take that potential that you're starting to connect to maybe today, you can take it forward. So, and there are people who can definitely support you in that. Thank you.
I would say that's a very good note to end on. Do you want to speak, or you're just holding the microphone? So that's a good note to end on. And let me just say thank you for your attention. I've deeply, deeply appreciated it. Deeply appreciate the invitation from David and from Faye and from Lena and others to come here and share this with you. It will be absolutely meaningless all by itself. But with everything else in the context of what's going on in your efforts here at the School of Administration and also the EU, that the potential here is enormous. And I feel very, very gratified to be a small piece of that. So thank you very much for your attention.
I don't know whether we're still on web streaming or not. I suspect it's probably got lost in the ether somewhere. John, I don't think we're still on, right? Okay. People have begun to have to slip away, so I think this is an appropriate time to finish. But thank you very, very much indeed for that. Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to my wonderful team again for having made this possible. And let's nurture those seeds that have been sown today. Thank you very much. Bye.